he looks at different technologies and different aspects of society and talks about how they break down, how the entropy in a system accumulates to lead to a functional collapse of systems. We're not going to talk about his work, but I kind of feel like we're living it anyways at this point in life. So this will be our first lecture. We're going to have a seminar on Wednesday and then group work on Friday, and then the second lecture, of course, on Thursday. Did everybody get the announcement about the readings for the seminar tomorrow on Canvas? So we'll talk about some of those today, but tomorrow during the seminar, we'll go into depth on some of these metric methods of evaluating civilization. So before we get going, any questions? Anybody had any problems with Canvas or any of the online interfaces that we have to deal with? Everybody's good? All right. Do you have a full view of the slide share, or do you have my notes showing as well? Is it just the red screen showing on the share?
No, it's PowerPoint, like fully.
With the next slide and everything showing?
Yes.
All right, let's see if we can. All right, how's that? Good. All right, so the rise and fall of complex societies. Again, it seems that we've living in this time of history where we're actually in a laboratory, where we're actually seeing some of the types of stresses that go into the breakdown of society. And if you're watching the news and seeing what's going on in the United States and in some other places, you're seeing elements of the dissolution of state authority, state power, state bureaucracy, the ability of the state to adapt and to support the people of that state. And so it's not saying that we're collapsing, but what you're seeing are some of the elements that go into collapse. And that's some of the stuff that we're going to develop, and we're going to try and build some new theories about it as we go through this term. This is an open course, so understand that there will be people viewing from Facebook, and they may also interject questions into the course as we go along. If you have a question while I'm talking, go ahead and send a text message or raise your hand, or use the clap or thumbs up signal so that I notice, and I'll try to address it in a timely manner. If it's something that's really urgent, go ahead and turn your mic on and let me know. So a little bit about myself. I'm an anthropological archaeologist with extensive field experience in places like Mexico and Guatemala, in North Korea, South Korea, all of Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, Austria, and then I've been running a project in Egypt since 2007. So I've got a lot of experience working all over the world. I come from a school that focused on cultural ecology, cultural materialism, looking at the physical aspects of culture rather than the more ideological and metaphysical aspects of it. Not that I ignore that, but the perspective that I was brought up in, the intellectual lineage to my professors, goes back to some of the founding professors who came up with the field of cultural ecology, Julian Stewart in particular. And we'll talk about one of his colleagues and professors, actually, Leslie White, later on in this lecture. So as we get started, I want to start off with a little bit of that metaphysical culture, that spiritual aspect of what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a poem to listen to, and as you listen to it, I want you to think about what it means to you when you're in a cemetery or walking among the ruins of an ancient city, or even looking at a burned down house in your own town, and how that affects you mentally, and what it does to your psyche, what type of aspects of your role in society and the role of that, whatever you're looking at in society, how that affects you.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
So Shelley wrote that poem inspired by the ruins of a colossus of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. And for those who are attuned with Egyptology, you probably realize that the statue that I'm showing here is actually Amenhotep III, a predecessor of Ramses II. But I thought this one kind of captured the spirit of what Shelley was talking about. Ramses II, however, is someone who was the most powerful pharaoh probably ever that existed in Egypt, and who left the most monuments and most children, and the longest reign and the biggest impact on the Egyptian empire during the New Kingdom of Egypt. He's probably the pharaoh, or one of the pharaohs, who are talked about in the Bible when we talk about the Exodus. So Ramses II, or as Shelley calls him, Ozymandias, and if you read the Greek over here, I think I can do a spotlight or something. Okay, so here the Greek, the Ozymandias, that's the Greek name for Ramses II. And so here is one of his shrines and temples at Abu Simbel in Aswan, Egypt. So this is the very southern extent of Egypt, the very far south of the main part of Egypt, where the cataracts start and break up the Nile, so that it's not possible for a ship to go farther south or come from the south past the cataracts. You can see that the effort that Ramses went to have his visage carved on the sides of mountains, on temples all across. Versus Yul Brynner playing Ramses II in the movie Moses from the late 1950s. And here you also see an Egyptian identification card that they actually issued him his own ID when he had to be transported, his mummy had to be transported across the border, that he needed to have appropriate ID so that they could transport his body. So they issued him an identification card. He also has a passport. So Ramses, who died over 3,000 years ago, continues to live in the Egyptian bureaucracy. So the dictionary gives us a definition of civilization. Give me 1 second, let me open up, just in case anyone throws any questions at me while I'm talking. I need to be able to see those, I think. I hope that they come in. Civilization. Oh no. The stage of human social and cultural development and organization that is considered most advanced. So when we talk about the way humans organize themselves, we use the term civilization when we're talking about the epitome of human achievement when it comes to social, political, and cultural aspects. If we take a look at another definition, one provided by Wikipedia, a civilization, or civilization if you're spelling it in the British way with an S, is any complex society characterized by urban development, social stratification, imposed by a cultural elite, symbolic systems of communication, for example, writing systems, and a perceived separation from and domination over the natural environment. So if we go back, think about what we just looked at with Ramses. What attributes of civilization do you see in those various slides that we looked at after the poem of Ozymandias, or including the poem of Ozymandias and those pictures that I showed of Ramses? What elements of civilization in these very broad definitions that are given by the dictionary fit to what we just looked at?
Everything.
Everything. Okay, but I identify a few of them. Yes.
Well, if you allow me, there is urban development because cities get built under his reign. There is social stratification and elite because the pharaoh himself was an elite. There is symbolic system, kind of, as we can see on the example of his name being underlined and expressed through symbols. And there is, of course, a separation from natural environment. All these buildings are built from the stone, but still they are separate from that. And mountains get carved, and image of Pharaoh appears here.
Yeah, no, those are all really good points. What else? How about his identification card from the modern Egyptian government? What does that represent? Does it represent the concept of bureaucracy, of layers of administrative work, of a political complexity to a state, that they have people who issue identification cards, so they keep track of you, that there's all these records that are kept. it shows a high level of sophistication of both keeping the records and the layers of bureaucracy that are used to generate and track that information, and the laws that require that information. How about the poem Ozymandias by Shelley? Does that represent civilization also? Let me see, one head nodding, come on. Do you guys not consider poetry civilization? Maybe not in the political sense, but in the cultural sense, when we use the word of being civilized.
And can we, in this case, use it like symbolic system of communication or not?
Yes, actually. And that's something we'll deal with in another class at a much higher level, I think, next year, related to our article on cultural evolution that I just published. But yeah, I mean, what we do as we increase in complexity is we find different ways of communicating information to each other. And of course, you know, originally it would be very simple, well, first verbal or just sounds, language, written symbols with very specific meanings and sounds to mimic the words and direct the words. And then everything that we do artistically in poetry, in music, in painting, those are all ways of taking information, our experience of the world, putting it into a form that we can then use to transfer to other people, to share with other people so that they're having that same cultural experience. So it's a way of taking information in the universe and transmitting it to others, which is one of the definitions of culture, of course, is sharing these shared ideas and beliefs. All right, so I put down a few synonyms for civilization also. So cultivation, culture, elegance, politeness, and refinement. So when we use the word civilized, what do we contrast it against? The antonyms, the opposites of civilization: barbarism, boorishness, brutality, clownishness, coarseness, grossness, rudeness, rusticity, savagery, vulgarity. So when we use the term civilization and we refer to ourselves as civilized, which I think most of us do, I have to keep switching windows so I can see you guys. Do we use it in part to contrast ourselves to people who are uncivilized? Is there a danger in that perspective?
Yeah, maybe sometimes so, because for instance, when our parents say to us that you are civilized, why are you behaving like a wild animal?
Do you have personal experience with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so who's uncivilized in the world today?
Maybe some tribes, as we think, according to our assumptions.
Okay, so say in the very beginning there was a picture of me up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea with some people. Are they uncivilized and I'm civilized? Would you say?
You mean Egypt people, right?
No, Papua New Guinea.
Huh.
Yeah. So in the very beginning, there was a picture of me with some people. The women had no shirts on, and they'd just done a ritual of welcoming when they arrived at their village. So Are they civilized? Not wearing clothes, you know, very simple lives comparative to us, somewhat enviable, I gotta say. Would they be considered uncivilized? So if you look at these pictures, who's civilized here and who's uncivilized? We say that the people on the left, the kind of Victorian England, they're civilized, right? Victorians, proper, repressed sexually, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or not the beginning, the middle of the Industrial Revolution, you know, a well-established hierarchy, a lot of different aspects of society as far as refinement and culture. And then you have the Victorian gentleman in Africa with the native population. So we would say that the Victorian English are civilized and the Africans would be uncivilized. So what are we referring to? How do the Africans differ from us? Is it intellectually, biologically, culturally, politically, technologically?
Maybe yes, in all these aspects, because we try to use our own frame and apply it to other people.
Yeah, and the point I want to make here is how we have to be careful about the implicit judgments when we talk about being civilized versus uncivilized, because it's very contextual. You may be civilized by this definition, but you know, if you look at what's going on in the United States with the protests in the street, I would say that a lot of those Americans are pretty uncivilized right now. You know, they don't accept that there are restrictions that they have to have on their movement and mobility. They're running around with guns, threatening implicitly violence, if not specifically, tied in with a lot of hatred and racist stuff that's being shown. I would say they're pretty uncivilized, even though they're coming out of American society, which is theoretically civilized, right? So I think you have to be careful about taking the term that's referring to a level of political organization, political complexity, and applying it to individuals and to people with any sort of pejorative, with a negative consideration of what those people are like. If we look at Rome, here, if you look on the right, of course, here's a patrician, a Roman gentleman, holding busts of his ancestors, right? So he's involved in ancestor worship. He has authority and a lineage associated with those ancestors, the statues of the ancestors he's holding. And you compare that on the left to the Gauls sacking Rome in 410 AD, not the Gauls, the Visigoths. So, and of course the Alaric sacking Rome there in the center painting. So to the Romans, is it very clear who the barbarians are and who the civilized people are? In ancient societies and in modern societies, we tend to cast judgments on people who are living outside of where we are. So the uncivilized, the barbarians, the savages, the natives. Having spent a lot of time with a lot of these uncivilized people, I'll tell you what, most of them I consider more civilized probably than 80% of the Americans I've lived with. They are intelligent and they're well adapted to the places where they live. If I want to live out in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, they can start a fire with a couple of sticks and a pebble, a little bit of moss, and seconds. Been around as far as just their their knowledge of where they live. So we're going to be talking about civilization. We're going to be talking about complex societies this term, and I tend to use the term complex societies because really I think that's a better measure of what we're looking at. When we're looking at social institutions, the nature of our lives are complex. Our politics are complex, really complex right now. Our biology, understanding a virus that's going around. I mean, we map the DNA, or not the DNA, the RNA of this virus, you know, and so we're operating at this level of complexity in the universe where we have all this data, all this information, you know, where you're growing up and you have no idea probably what you're going to do for a living. Yet someone in Papua New Guinea, they know exactly what they're going to do when they grow up. So you have this level of complexity and stress that comes on you being in the society of having to choose and differentiate what you're going to do and how you're going to live. There's so much complexity. There's so many different opportunities, but also so many different traps to be caught in that can lead to stress and failure. And that stress is important too, because we're going to talk about that later on as we talk about different theories about why societies collapse. And there's some parallels between what you might feel as an individual or what your house might feel as stress that could lead to, you know, nervous breakdown or to the collapse of your household or your community or your church or your school or whatever, that all these institutions going from the individual up to the most complex level of institution have to deal with stress. There's always stresses coming on there. The more complex you are, the more opportunities for stress there are. And so we're going to look at that and try to come up with different ways to measure that and understand the dynamics associated with the collapse of societies. To do that, what we want to first look at is the structure of society. How is society built? What are the sources of that complexity so that we can understand what's not working when a society moves towards collapse or eventually it does collapse. Just elaborating a little bit on what we were talking about, this concept of outsiders. The word barbarian originated in ancient Greek and was initially used to describe all non-Greek speaking peoples, including Persians, Egyptians, Medes, and Phoenicians. The ancient Greek word barbaros, from which it derives, means babbler, and was onomatopoeic. That is a word that sounds like what it means. In the Greek ear, speakers of a foreign tongue made unintelligible sounds, bar, like a sheep, similar to words that exist in other Indo-European languages, including Sanskrit, Barbara, which means stammering. So there's kind of a universal trend that we'll see, because you see the same process that you see for the etymology of the word barbarian. You see that among the Aztecs as well. In the Nahuatl language, they'll refer to people as chantal, and that refers to anybody who speaks a language that the Aztecs weren't particularly familiar with in Mexico or Mesoamerica, and it referred to speaking from your throat. So someone who spoke chantal was someone who was speaking another language. It sounded funny because it was coming from the throat. So that concept of barbarian, they also used other words like otomi, which meant somebody who used a bow and arrow and was a hunter-gatherer living out usually in the deserts or very austere conditions, or Chichimex, which was the Aztec origin when they were nomadic peoples. So these were all terms used to refer to people who they tended to look down upon a little bit, or sometimes a lot. But they also used it to stereotype people. And so I also put, one of your assignments was to watch a video this week. Take a look at that, because that's going to talk about this phenomena of savagery and barbarism of people living up in the mountains. So I just want you to, again, this is a point of contrast, that we use civilization, but civilization means something because we contrast it to uncivilized people, right? If everyone was civilized, there would be no question about it. But we consider some people civilized and some people not civilized. And that's been really important particularly in the evolution of complex societies, because a lot of how they justify their treatment of other people, whether it's colonialism or slavery, comes from building a hierarchy based on them being the epitome of it, civilized, and other people not. So, turning to the term of complex society, the sister term to civilization, a complex society is a concept that is shared by a range of disciplines, including anthropology, archaeology, history, and sociology, to describe a stage of social formation. The concept was formulated by scholars attempting to understand how modern states emerged, specifically the transition from small kin-based societies to large hierarchical structured societies. So we'll get into this more in the coming lectures, but just what's your impression of that definition? Why do you think there's a contrast between kin-based societies and other more complex societies? Do you exist in a kin-based network? You live in a nuclear family? So it's a natural way for people to organize themselves, right? You've got a mother and a father, usually some uncles and aunts, maybe a grandfather, maybe a great-grandfather, great-grandmother, some cousins. And so we naturally, because of our biology, of the way that we procreate, form into these kin-shaped groups. So that's kind of our lowest level, our most common denominator level of social and political and economic organization. So then, as we think about what happens to society through time, as people become more complex and we build on these layers of aspects, of characteristics of what we think of as complex society, how that changes that organization. You don't necessarily lose it completely, but its role in your life is subsumed in other more complex and other layered aspects of social and political organization. So it's an important sort of hallmark of looking at the difference between complex societies and simpler societies. So some of the characteristics of complex societies are states with a large population where its economy is structured according to specialization and division of labor. These economic features spawn a bureaucratic class and institutionalize inequality. What do you think of that statement, that first characteristic of complex societies? Do you feel like you live in a complex society of institutionalized inequality?
Yes.
Surely.
Well, what ways do you feel that inequality?
We can focus on some country, right? Or just in the
You
whole
can focus
world?
on yourself or on another country. How do you feel inequality? What are some of the sources of inequality that you experience?
Yeah, we can say that all evils go from capitalism, for instance, or I don't know, or from political state and so on. But we also can appeal to our personal experience.
Did you say evil or inequality?
Yeah, inequality
Okay.
is evil.
Is it evil? Are you and I equal?
I want to ask many questions, like in which terms and how, in what aspects will look.
Well, that's the point, is that there's lots of different inequality. Are you equal to your parents in a sense? Or maybe even an older sibling, who may have a higher status than you? Your professors, theoretically have either a higher, sometimes it feels like a lower status maybe. That there's different types of inequality, and they're not necessarily evil or bad. There's economic inequality, which might have more connotations of evil, right? Particularly from a Marxian philosophy. But on the other hand, from a capitalist philosophy, people who earn more, supposedly, and all things being equal, worked harder and maybe deserve a certain level of inequality because of the effort that they put in, and that they were inspired by the ability to earn more. So, and some of it's very circumstantial, right? You might be confronting a police officer, and that police officer has more power than you at that moment, at least, right? When it comes to dealing with in that particular circumstance, and just like your professor in the terms of the classroom, that I have a certain level of power and authority over you, and so it's not an equal status. So there's all sorts of opportunities for inequality. Now, how about like that Highland tribe in Papua New Guinea I was talking about? How much inequality is there?
Well, the only inequality that can probably exist here is the one that is connected with the division of labor, because someone hunts, someone gathers things, someone just sits home and watches, like, for children, let's say. But that's still not that much of inequality in comparison to what we have now, let's say, in complex societies.
Yeah, no, the types of inequality you have are the ones that are ascribed by your status that is innate to you. So because of your being a child or an elder or a parent. And so people can gain more status in a village like that, but it's only based on the authority that they are able to exert from their personality. Now things have changed a little bit where they have elected councils and things like that. But traditionally, if there's a leader in the group, it's somebody who's referred to as a big man. And it was, as long as he was able to convince people to go along with him, he had power. He had no codified power. It was all given to him by the others willingly and easily revoked. In one of the villages I went to, there was a big man. He was, fairly powerful in the village. He had a lot of pigs, some good farmland where they would do horticulture. When I left the village, I gave him some gifts. I gave him an axe and a few other gifts. I came back to the village a couple of years later, and I asked for him, and I said, "Hey, where is Soma, this man I knew?" And they all looked down. They wouldn't look at me. And later, I met the school teacher from the village down in the city of Leh in Papua New Guinea, and he said, "Dr. J, you asked about Soma." I said, "Yes." And he said, "You have to understand that we believe in witchcraft." And I said, "Yes, I know that." And he said, "Well, Soma had killed some people using magic in the village." He says, "Remember when you were there that a child had died?" Which I did remember. A child died of cerebral malaria. And he said, "Well, Soma had killed that child, and then he killed several other people afterwards, so we exiled him from the village. We drove him out of the village." It's common in a society like this that if somebody gets an attitude, starts feeling really powerful, starts bossing other people around, that there will be accusations of using black magic or witchcraft and sorcery. They'll just like you might do if someone pisses you off in your social circle in school, you might say bad things about them, right? Oh, you know what she did? They will do that in the village as well. And that becomes a means of regulating people's behavior. And so it helps maintain that equality by using a verbal regulation, which in this case led to him, I hope, that he was indeed exiled, because people like that are often killed as well in those villages, that he had to take his family and go find some relatives in another village and live over there because he'd pissed off enough people in the village that they sent him packing. And it was done by making allegations that anything that bad happened, they blamed it on him, on the black magic. So in an egalitarian society, in a society where people are mostly equal, regulation isn't formalized by laws as much as by just social relations. Even negative gossip will be a way of regulating people's behavior. You compare that to our society where, we are now under lockdown, and if you violate that lockdown, you know how much the fine will be. If you spread the virus to somebody and that person dies, you know how long you might look to go to prison if they show that you are the one who did it. So in a society like this, you know who your president is, and you know the authority that he is granted by an election, at least in theory, and who your governor is, and council members, and the different layers of politicians. So all of this authority is regulated and codified as compared to the simpler society where it's mostly just done by social relationships.
Can I ask a question then?
Of course.
So can we say that this term also can be changed through time? Because if we speak about economic features like specialization and division, I don't know, it can be changed, or we cannot come back to this stage without this aspect.
Oh, no, absolutely. You mean, can we move up and down from complexity to simplicity?
I ask about the term itself, because it implies that we have specialization and division. Can we imagine the situation without that? So if we come back, or maybe it will just, I don't know, lost through time.
I think I understand what you're saying. Could we have a society that's complex but egalitarian? Is that what you're asking? So could we like the ideal of a utopian communism where everybody's equal and shares in the resources and authority? Is that what you're asking?
I thought that complex society should have a division of labor and specialization, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that is popular right now and possible. I don't know. I mean that before we haven't these things, right?
Yeah. The definitions aren't fixed except for by the theory that sociologists and anthropologists bring to them, and you're going to see as we go through this lecture that there's a lot of different ways to view complexity. So it's not fixed as a term, but there are characteristics that I think just like when we were looking at if I say Russia, you think of a nation state and a complex society. If I think of the Timbaga of Papua New Guinea, you think of people who are, less complex. They're living in a simpler society without all the layers of bureaucracy and complexity and decisions and economic complexity and differentiation in jobs. So the terms certainly have. I think there's clear a bimodal distribution when you look at societies, but there's a lot of gray area also. So, and we'll look at some of this and try to see how people have tried to quantify the various aspects of what determines a complex society or a civilization. And of course, once complex, you can strip away everything, and people can go back to, if civilization broke down and the virus wipes out 90% of the population and the institutions don't survive, we would go back down to operating largely in a simpler fashion, although we may carry a lot of the baggage that we learned from complexity to try and rebuild a more complex society again. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So some of the other characteristics, archaeologically, features such as big architectural projects and prescribed burial rites. So when we looked at the mummification of Ramses II or the temple at Abu Simbel, I mean, there's this real monumental aspect to civilization. Large-scale agricultural development, which allows members of society time for specialized skill sets. When we look at the evolution of societies, we'll find that if people could produce more food than they needed, that means they could support other people who are now not involved in food production. Those people can then become involved in other crafts, become specialized. And that, of course, is essential to building a layered society where people are doing other tasks than just procuring food, that they can be involved in doing artistic things and engineering and building monuments. Organized political structure. So when you talk about how do you organize a lot of people, once you get over about 500 people, it becomes very tough to organize them in an informal way. You start to need to build formal institutions. Again, just as we were talking about some of those characteristics here, where you have the monumental architecture and the writing system at Abu Simbel, the mummification, the rites of the dead, the artisanship, the craftsmanship for building the statues, and so many other things from ancient Egypt. We already covered that. So let's move into the 19th century. So here we're talking about the time period where anthropology is taking shape as a science. And we're beginning to have people, you have the input of the colonial period, of the exploration that began in Western Europe in the 16th century or 15th century, but really began to become incorporated into a system where people were pulling a lot of economic resources from the colonies, where they're having a lot more interaction with the colonial peoples, the people who they had conquered and colonized. And so the scholars in Europe began to try to order and make sense of the different ways that people were organized in the world. So Lewis Henry Morgan was an American scholar. In 1877, he wrote a book called Ancient Society, where he argued that there were three stages of social political organization, three ways that people organized themselves. One was savagery. So he broke those down into three categories: lower, middle, and upper savagery. The next was barbarism, again, broken into lower, middle, and upper barbarism. And then the civilization, the epitome, which is the perspective that he was writing from as an American scholar, born of the European tradition. And that the way he made these categories was he looked at the lower to higher stages as a developmental process, as a linear progress of people becoming more sophisticated based on their technological innovations. So the characteristics that he used to measure these societies, he called ethna. So these ethnic characters of the society that he was able to use to try to create some sort of scientific method for comparing human societies. Again, they focused on inventions and discoveries in domestic institutions. So let's look at a couple of these. So number one, he had subsistence. So the arts of subsistence are natural subsistence at the lowest level, where you rely upon fruits and roots. And then you can go to fishing subsistence, and then cultivation, and then domestication of animals for meat and milk, and then intensive field agriculture. Another one is this third one. He looked at language. He looked at the origin of language as just using gestures, like when you watch me talk with my hands. Imagine if I had no words and that was my entire lecture, right? Using natural symbols. And then going to monosyllabical languages, where the language is fairly simple. And then going to much more complex languages where you have multiple syllables that are able to be put together in much more complex ways for much more complex thoughts. He looked at the organization of the family. Forms of family at the lower level are based on blood relationships, so consanguine relationships, intermarriage of brothers and sisters. He used the Hawaiian term, the Punaluan relationship, where your marriage might be between different clans, but a group of brothers and a group of sisters from the clans might each marry to each other, creating a bond between the clans. And in a situation like that, brother and uncle, or father and uncle, they don't have that distinction, right? Your uncle would be your father just like your father would be. The Syndiasmian system, where you start to get to monogamous marriage, so just a husband and wife, what we think of more of the nuclear family. Patriarchal, where you have one man with multiple wives, and then monogamous society, where it's one man with one woman. So if we look at Morgan's concept of savagery, which he considered this sort of natural level of subsistence for societies for at least 60,000 years. So you go back to longer than 60,000 years, really, going back to basically the dawn of modern humans, when you look at the archaic humans arising with the Denisovians and the Neanderthals, that they're living at this fundamental basic level as Morgan views it. So the lowest level of savagery, again, looking at fruit and root, living in tropical or subtropical habitats. Basically, it's just one step above the rest of the animals on the planet. You might have simple gestures, language. You have blood related. You have a nuclear family, perhaps based on blood relations. A level of intelligence, but he's seeing this as a very low level of survival. And you get to middle savagery, and now people are fishing. They're beginning to use fire. The spread of people worldwide along shorelines. The beginnings of language, where they're able to use symbols formed that are even if they're only one syllable, that they're using much more complex than just hand gestures or simple grunts and sounds. And you get to that Punaluan family organization, where people are starting to create larger networks based on marriage relationships that include more of a clan-like structure, where people are interrelated with a lot more freedom between members of the family. So that saying that it takes a village. So in this case, the entire village is part of that family. And then you get to upper savagery. Now they're using weapons, bows and arrows, clubs, spears. using a lot more game in the diet. He throws cannibalism. There's a question, Sonia? No. Again, now you're getting to a true language where people are using full syllables in their speaking. You're having relationships where people are married and are recognizing that relationship even if they don't live together. You're breaking down into phratries and tribes. You're getting a level of religion, of worshiping the elements of the earth, animistic religions, where you recognize the forces of power in nature around you. And then we go to barbarism. So now you have horticulture, right? Simple agriculture, where people are starting to grow things like corns and beans, squash, tobacco. You have pottery. You have larger political organizations, tribal confederacies, weaving, use of things like the blowgun, so more sophisticated weapons or cleverer ones. People are stockading their villages for protection. People are playing games with, tribal games where they compete within each other for entertainment. You have more of a centralized religion where you have a great spirit as opposed to every tree being a spirit or every animal being a spirit. Now you're recognizing that some sort of larger spirit in the world. Middle barbarism, much more domestication of animals. Again, he looks at the Semitic, the Middle Eastern people. You have domestication of goats, sheep, horse, donkeys, cows, dogs, animals for milk. People begin working with bronze. They begin using irrigation to expand and intensify their farms. Larger joint houses, so apartment complexes. You go to upper barbarism, cultivation, where you're actually growing grains and cereals. You're working with iron ore. You're having these beginnings of what we were calling civilized before, of culture, of poetry and mythology, more sophisticated protection in walled cities, wheeled vehicles, metallic armor, and weapons, so using both bronze and iron with forges, pottery wheels for increased production of pottery, grain mills for increased production or conversion of the grain into meal that can be used to make bread, loom weaving, so you're having much greater technology as far as the production of cloth. You're getting to monogamous relationships and family relationships. You're having popular assemblies where people are meeting in groups to make political decisions. So it's a big step forward. And of course, this is the precursor to moving to civilization. And so he breaks civilization down to ancient, medieval, and modern. Again, in ancient, you have the introduction of the plow. Again, agricultural intensification. That means fewer people can make enough food for the rest. Iron implements, you're using animal power. So you're getting that extra energy out of the animals. Basically, you're not dependent on subsistence, that food is able to be produced in abundance. Your alphabet is a full phonetic alphabet with writing. He sees the introduction of Arabic numerals, the military arts, so as you're competing with other political institutions that you create a specialization of warriors. The introduction of coinage, the concept of a state as a larger political entity with territorial limits that are defined. In inventions like the bridge and the arch, the use of the crane, the water wheel, sewers for moving waste water away. Go to medieval and you start to get Gothic architecture, so your big cathedrals. A political organization based on a feudal aristocracy with hereditary titles and ranks. A hierarchy under headship of a pope when it comes to ideology. And then it's again remember that this is published in 1877, that he sees the epitome of civilization as the telegraph, coal, gas, spinning jenny, power looms, steam engines, telescopes. Imagine what he would feel if he saw us having a Zoom meeting now, when he was so impressed with the telegraph and thought that was the epitome of civilization. So when you think of Henry Morgan's concept of this hierarchy, what do you think? Do you see problems with it as a way of comparing civilizations? Not civilizations, comparing cultures?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
So I understand that the highest level of civilization, according to him, is his time, like the first part of 20th century. But if we imagine where are we now, according to this scheme, are we more better civilization, or we out of this scheme, or what?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's of course a really good question. And if we were writing the same scale now, it would look very different, wouldn't it? Particularly at the epitome of civilization, that we might go to something that's a higher level, or simply translate telegraph to internet, steam engine, to nuclear power. That we could update the technology and still say it's at that level. Or if we want to look down on the 19th century, we could say that they're a lower level of civilization, we're better. Because our technology is better, exponentially better, things that they couldn't even dream of. So it's a big issue, and it's one of the, as we go on here and we take a look at V. Gordon Child's work next, one of the problems with Morgan's work is that one thing, it was very racist coming out of the 19th century. It was something that's called unilineal, where it tended to look at civilization on a single line, that you're here or you're here, and you're somewhere along that line. That the best thing for you to do is to move up along that line, among those stages, and that was your goal as a culture, was to improve yourself until you could get to where the Europeans were at the time that they were writing. And so that was seen as the ideal place to be, is to be at that top of civilization. So you can see that there's a lot of innate prejudice in this sort of model that Morgan drew up. And it's very limited because it's all focusing on these technologies. And as you pointed out, it was Daria, I think, who said that the technology is something that's very fluid and of a particular time in history. And we're in a new technology that makes the Victorian tech. If we ran into a planet, and it was occupied by people who had steam engines and telegraphs, we would think they were pretty primitive people, technologically compared to us. Likewise, if aliens made it to us, and we'll get to that at the end of the lecture, we probably won't make it until Thursday. If aliens came to us, if they had the technology to get to us, probably they're going to look at us as pretty primitive, I would think. And we'll take a look at one of the scales of measuring extraterrestrial civilizations, that we're the bottom of the scale on Earth, frankly. And so it's the scale that's the basis of the SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, developed by a Russian cosmonaut back in the 60s. So, but we'll talk about that. We'll get to that on Thursday. So yeah, so that's exactly right. Is that this scale has a lot of issues with it. One is it forcing everybody to operate down the same line, looking at, for instance, metal technology. Lewis Henry Morgan wrote another paper called Montezuma's Supper, where he had put the Aztec Empire into the realm of Middle barbarism because they didn't have iron, And so he interpreted everything he saw from the Aztecs, and he'd sent a researcher down there, a man named Bandelier, Alfonso Bandelier, down to Mexico to collect data on the Aztecs, what was left of the Aztecs after the Spanish occupation, but to learn what he could. But then Morgan interpreted everything to force the Aztecs into his concept of middle barbarism, because that's where he determined they had to be, because they didn't have iron weapons. Yet, if we look at the Aztec Empire, when you come to complexity, when you come to nobility, when you come to language, when you come to other aspects of their technological, their agricultural production was extremely sophisticated, their political organization very sophisticated, their religion very elaborate, their artistic traditions, all these other aspects that you might use to measure civilization, monumental architecture, they excelled at. But he had to interpret it to fit into his scheme. So he said, no, the Spanish, when they talked about the Montezuma's Supper, that it was the Spanish conquistadors, they were deluded, that they didn't really know what they were looking at. But he knew better because he had a scheme that he could fit them into. The Spanish knew exactly what they were looking at, and the Spanish, after they conquered Mexico, happily married into women of nobility, of Aztec nobility, so that these common Spanish soldiers coming out of Europe accepted very readily that they could marry into a noble family of the Aztecs and become nobility, thereby having elevated their status by marrying into the Aztec nobility, recognizing that the Aztec system had as much legitimacy in Mexico as being a lord in England or in Europe. So yeah, that's one of the big problems with Morgan's system, is that he had a narrow range of what people could do, and if they violated any of his precepts that are within that unilineal model, they had to go down to the rung where he thought they belonged, and he would not give due attention to the levels of political complexity, socio-political complexity, and economic complexity, and military complexity, and everything else associated with civilization, because he didn't want to violate his scheme, because he thought that was the way to define people. So let's jump up 75 years or so to V. Gordon Childe. In 1950, he wrote a book called Urban Revolution. So here's this Australian archaeologist who coins this term, the urban evolution, as he looks at the progress that people made with the rise of agricultural villages. So a time period that we call the Neolithic, right after the Ice Age ends about 10,000 years ago. And suddenly we have this proliferation of people figuring out how to domesticate crops and therefore become tied to the land, but able to therefore get more consistent food and intensify their production of food by farming. So this Neolithic revolution, this urban revolution, because now if people can stay in one place and grow food in one place, they can also settle in that place. And so you have this building of villages and towns and cities that begins with the end of that ice age. So that moving from the Paleolithic, the old Stone Age, to the Neolithic, the new Stone Age. They don't have iron or metal tools, but you don't need those for agriculture. And once they settle, that they begin to learn to use things like copper, a period called the Chalcolithic, as we move into after a couple thousand years, and then bronze, and then of course eventually iron, which becomes by 1000 BC, becomes the standard metal for tools and weapons. So, like Morgan, Childe identified a series of criteria for evaluating the complexity of cultures and civilizations. So he used 10 formal criteria. So number one, for defining civilization, was the appearance of urban centers, cities, big towns, places where many people, hundreds of people or thousands of people could all live in close proximity and work together. Full-time specialists, craftsmen, merchants, officials, priests, who instead of working for organizations instead of producing food, that they were organizing the people who produce food. They were commanding the extra grain. They were taking that as taxes and redistributing it and using it to accumulate wealth. And so you had people who were involved in the food production, and then you began to develop this class of people who were not directly involved in food production, but instead were organizing and managing different aspects of the society. You have monumental public buildings, and we'll come back to this one later. I highlighted it, so as we get to some of the later sections, we can refer back to that. A sizable surplus product, again, withdrawn by elites from taxes or tribute. The isolating of ruling groups, so you begin to have this development of status within the society. So you have priests and civil servants and civil rulers and military leaders and officials. So people begin to kind of stratified, to line up by different roles where they're set apart from others. You have the appearance of written language and numerical notation from which emerged science. You have the appearance of arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Development of sophisticated artistic styles. The appearance of long-distance trade. So people begin to regulate economic relations with peoples in other areas. And social solidarity, which is represented or misrepresented by ideological means in the temple or a sepulcher, shrine. The idea of a state formation, and you see in the background there is the mausoleum of Ho Chi Minh. Just like you have the mausoleum of Lenin, that it becomes a symbol of the state identity. It becomes a way of building solidarity by recognizing a founding father of your nation. And so that becomes one of your focal points that helps to create that sense of solidarity among the people who are identified with that state. In America, we look at George Washington, one of the founding father, the first president, the one who fought the war, led the military against the British to get independence for America. So we use him as a symbol. You see him on the $1 bill, a reinforced symbol to help build that solidarity and that identification to maintain the order of the state. So a number of other scholars have kind of chimed into this. So just to review a couple of these real quick, let me take a look at the time here. Okay, we have about 15 minutes, I think. So you look at Robert McAdams, The Evolution of Urban Society, 1966. He emphasized the class within a society, so the political hierarchy. The nature of administration, the nature of territorial divisions, the breaking down into territory and establishing hard boundaries, the independence of the political institutions of the state, and then that specialization again of labor and handicraft. Vadman Mason wrote the book First Civilizations, 1989, and he had this triad of attributes that he thought were most important. And that was the town, monumental architecture, and written language. He thought if you have those three things, you've got civilization. So he's trying to reduce it down to what were the essential characters of a society that we could look at and call it civilized or a complex society. Colin Renfrew in 1972, again, emphasizing, trying to narrow it down to a few things: social stratification, highly developed handicraft specialization, again, those towns, the written language, and then this emphasis on monumental spiritual construction. Now, remember, I highlighted that one before in Child's list, and that's one that some people are going to challenge as we think about the different types of societies we know in both living and, in particular, archaeologically. So I want to spend a little time with the measurement of cultural complexity, because George Murdoch tried to build off of what Child had done, and he tried to come up with a way to view cultural complexity and actually measure it. So he came up with the 10 categories. So writing and records, fixity of residence. So are people sedentary? Are they living in one place? Agriculture, urbanization, technological specialization, land transport. How are people moving around? Are they walking, riding horses, using cars, airplanes? Money, population density, political integration, and social stratification. And then he took and scaled these from 0 to 4, each of these criteria, and he did it by, for 186 societies. So he created this database where he had 10 scores for each of 186 societies that he looked at. So just going through those criteria real quick. His first one, writing and records. This is a scale devised to take account of distinctions between literate and non-literate or pre-literate societies. Higher scores to writing, lower scores to non-written records or mnemonic devices. Mnemonic devices are using keys to help your memory. Those can be written symbols or different things you can do, or tying knots on a string, like you might see with the Inca in Peru. Fixity of residence, scale designed to indicate the extent to which the mode of life is sedentary or nomadic. Cultural complexity having frequently been found to be correlated with settled life. Mongols might disagree with that one. Scale of agriculture, or scale 3, agriculture. So this scale indicates the degree of dependence upon agriculture for subsistence and the intensity with which it is practiced. It's intended to provide a measure of the extent to which the society subsists by food production as opposed to food gathering. Scale 4, urbanization, a scale indicating the average population of local communities, is designed to measure the degree of urbanization of society. Large concentrations of population having frequently been found to be correlated with cultural complexity. Technological specialization, a scale designed to measure the degree of complexity and specialization of technological crafts. Land transport, designed to measure the degree of complexity in the means of land transportation, thus presumably indirectly the extent of intergroup trade. So the more efficient you are at communicating with each other, the more complexity, of course, it can add to your society. Money, measuring the degree of complexity with respect to the media of exchange, thus indirectly the level of economic organization. Density of population indicates the mean density of a population in the territory controlled or exploited by the society. Provides an indirect measure of cultural complexity, commonly considered to correlate with population density. Level of political integration indicates the complexity of a political organization in terms of the number of distinct jurisdictional levels recognizable in the society. So that concept of bureaucracy that we talked about with the ID card for Ramses II. And then social stratification, scale designed to indicate the relative complexity of graded status distinctions within the society. So just an example, I'm not going to go through all 10, but an example of one of them is just looking at writing and records. So here, if we start at the bottom, the 0, writing records and mnemonic devices in any form are lacking or unreported. So basically, we don't have any record of how these people communicated archaeologically. That, as far as we know, it was all verbal, and that was all they had. 1, writing and records are lacking, but that people employ mnemonic devices such as simple tallies. So maybe marking things, simple devices for aiding your memory, but no real system of record keeping. And number 2, lacks a true writing, but possesses a non-written record in the form of picture writing, quipus, that's the Inca knot tying, pictorial inscriptions, or the like. So I show an example here of one of the Rongorongo systems of writing from Easter Island. And so this is a mnemonic device. We think we can't really read it or understand it, but based on the number of symbols and the uses that we are able to detect, these symbols were used to convey a meaning to a person who's trained, that they could tell the story based on those symbols without reading any sort of phonetic value to that symbol. So it doesn't have, lacks significant accumulation of written records, or has a long script, a long used script of alien people. So people who borrowed a language from someone else. If you look at the Koreans, for instance, they had borrowed and used Chinese for a long time until the 15th century or so, when they decided to make their own written language, and then they developed Korean quite purposely as a scientifically designed language. But before that, they had borrowed this from the Chinese. And for indigenous systems of true writing, written records of at least modest significance. So now you've got a society that's got a track record. It's got, you know, when you look at cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, or hieroglyphic writing from Egypt, and papyrus scrolls from Egypt, or nowadays, you know, our hard drives, we have a record of what we've written about, whether it's art or poetry or tax records or other bureaucratic records, that we've become sophisticated in maintaining our written records. So these are the examples of scaling, just one of the examples, and you can imagine that all those other 10 categories all could have a similar scale from 0 to 4. So then he took his 186 societies, and each one scored out on these 10, and then he was able to rank them based on what their scores would be. So running a statistical correlation, he saw that there were certain things that tended to correlate together. And so in this case, he broke it down. He was looking at cultural complexity by region. And so if you look at, say, the insular Pacific one, I don't know. Can you see my cursor when it moves up and down? All right, so if we look at insular Pacific, you'll see that fixity of residence score is actually quite high when you cross-correlate all these 10 categories with each other for this particular region. So a lot of these people we don't necessarily think of as being complex societies living out in the Pacific, like in places like Papua New Guinea, yet they score high. And then they score very low for land transport, and they quite high for population density. Let me put this back on you. Why do you think that is?
They were living on islands.
You make it sound so obvious. Yes, of course. You know, and that's one of the failures of this sort of system, is that I mean, he captures it in the statistical analysis, but that there's a lot of cultural, ecological foundations that affect these variables that we use for measuring civilization. So you can have a high population density if you're living on a Pacific island where you have lots of fish and you have, you know, lots of coconuts. You know, you have these, you know, lots of root crops. So you have lots of calories growing naturally on these. You don't even have to do much cultivation, and then you throw in horticulture, throw in some pigs with the fishing, and you can have a quite high population on a very small piece of land because it's so productive. So when you look at these variables, it was important, I think, that he took a look at these regional indices and started to sort them out and think about what was going on with these attributes that we use to measure civilization, and where are their weaknesses when we think of them in these contexts. Are they really measuring complexity of society, or are they reflecting something else? South America, same sort of thing. If you look, you've got some very low indices, writing records, land transport, and money, and then pretty robust when it comes to fixed fixity of residence and agriculture. Yet we know that the Inca were one of the most sophisticated empires, not just a state, but an empire that had conquered and subsumed lots of other chiefdoms and states within that empire. And so they're scoring very low when it comes to money and land transport. Of course, a lot of it was up in the mountains, and so land transport was limited. And because he's looking at the technological levels, maybe he wasn't taking into account some of the road networks and things like that that were. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.
Bye. Do you enjoy Shaklo?